It was 1692, a year that would forever stain the history of a small New England village. Salem, a place of forests and farms, of tight-knit communities and hidden tensions, would become the stage for one of the most infamous episodes of mass fear in history. But this is not just a story of witches, spells, or superstition. This is a story of people, institutions, and fear. Of how suspicion, when amplified by law and belief, can consume an entire community. And why understanding Salem matters, even today. In this series, we will explore Salem chapter by chapter. We will uncover how centuries of European laws and theology transformed witchcraft into a legal crime. We will see how a village under pressure, divided by politics, property, and personality, became fertile ground for accusation. We will follow the first afflicted children whose visions and convulsions ignited a fire of hysteria, and watch how confessions and claims of spectral attacks became evidence in court. We will witness the rise of the courts, the court of Oya and Termina, and how justice itself was twisted to validate fear. We will confront the executions, the deaths, and the lives shattered. And finally, we will examine the aftermath, the apologies, and the enduring lessons Salem left for law, society, and culture. Why does this matter? Because Salem is not only a tragedy of its time. It is a warning across centuries. Fear left unchecked, legitimized by authority, can destroy the innocent. It teaches us about human nature, about the fragility of social trust, and the consequences when institutions fail to restrain panic. So, where are you watching from? Imagine yourself in Salem Village, the wind rustling through the trees, the shadows of suspicion creeping through every household. Picture the streets where neighbor watched neighbor, where whispered accusations could become a death sentence. If you are drawn to history, fascinated by human behavior, and intrigued by the thin line between fact and legend, subscribe to the channel and follow along as we uncover the true story behind the Salem Witch Trials. We will journey carefully, chapter by chapter, beginning with the origins of witchcraft as a historical crime, through the pressures and divisions of Salem, the outbreak of accusations, the workings of the courts, and finally, the aftermath and lasting significance. It is a story of law, belief, and fear, a story that shaped a community and left a legacy still felt today. Let us begin, chapter by chapter, to uncover the trials, the terror, and the lessons of Salem. Chapter 1. Witchcraft Historical Crime, 1300–1692. Before the rope tightened, before the fire was lit, before Salem learned its name would one day mean fear, there was a law, not a legend, not a superstition whispered in the dark, but a crime written in ink, sealed with authority, and enforced by courts that believed they were defending God himself. If you had lived in Europe 400 years ago, you would not have asked whether witches were real. You would have asked only one question: how close are they? Between the 14th and 18th centuries, Europe lived beneath an invisible terror, a terror without a face, a terror without borders. Historians estimate that approximately 110,000 individuals were formally accused of witchcraft across Europe between 1300 and 1800. Of those, between 40,000 and 60,000 were executed by hanging, burning, or beheading. These were not lynchings carried out by mobs in secret. They were legal proceedings. The accused were interrogated, records were kept, judges presided, sentences were pronounced with solemn certainty. Witchcraft, during this period, was not treated as folklore. It was treated as treason against the divine order. To understand Salem, one must first understand this world, a world where law, religion, and fear were inseparable. In medieval and early modern Europe, the universe was understood as a moral battlefield. God ruled from above, the devil worked below, and humanity stood in between, fragile, sinful, and vulnerable. Witchcraft emerged not merely as magical practice, but as a theological crime. Legally and doctrinally, it was defined by two central accusations. A witch was believed to have entered into a pact with the devil, a conscious rejection of God in exchange for power. And a witch was believed to commit maleficium, the deliberate use of supernatural forces to cause harm. Illness, crop failure, infertility, sudden death. None of these required physical proof. They required only belief, and suffering always provided witnesses. This definition transformed witchcraft into something far more dangerous than heresy alone. A heretic endangered the soul. A witch endangered the entire community. Witchcraft did not become a crime by accident. It was built, carefully, systematically, by institutions that commanded absolute trust. The church provided the theology. The state provided the punishment. By the late 15th century, manuals circulated throughout Europe, offering guidance on how to identify, interrogate, and condemn witches. The most infamous of these was published in 1487. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written by inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, presented witchcraft as an organized, satanic conspiracy. It insisted that skepticism itself was heresy. To doubt witches was to aid the devil. The book described how witches flew at night, how they summoned demons, how they harmed children and corrupted the faithful. Most importantly, it taught authorities how to extract confessions. Pain, it argued, revealed truth. The Malleus was not universally accepted, but its influence was immense. It provided intellectual justification for fear and turned suspicion into method. As fear hardened into doctrine, European governments transformed belief into statute. In England, witchcraft was formally criminalized through a series of laws, 1542, 1563, 1604, each tightening the legal noose around those accused, defining witchcraft as a crime against both God and crown. Accusation did not require physical evidence. Reputation mattered. Behavior mattered. Confession mattered most of all. Women, particularly older, poor, or socially isolated women, were disproportionately targeted. But men, children, clergy, and nobility were not immune. The law did not ask whether witchcraft existed. It asked only who was guilty. By the 17th century, Europe had normalized the idea that invisible enemies lived among the faithful. Communities were taught to monitor one another, to interpret misfortune as intent, to see deviation as danger. The witch was not always dramatic. She was ordinary. She lived next door. She spoke too sharply. She prayed differently. She survived when others did not. Witch trials became moments where private resentment acquired public legitimacy. Grief found explanation. Failure found blame. Power found justification. This was not chaos. It was order, constructed through fear. When English Puritans crossed the Atlantic in the early 17th century, they carried these beliefs with them. They did not see themselves as escaping Europe. They believed they were perfecting it. New England was imagined as a godly experiment, a society purified of corruption, watched closely by God, and threatened constantly by Satan. Puritan theology emphasized humanity's inherent sinfulness, God's active punishment of moral failure, and the devil's constant interference in human affairs. The wilderness surrounding the colonies was not neutral land. It was viewed as hostile, chaotic, and spiritually dangerous. In such a world, witchcraft was not unlikely. It was expected. English legal traditions regarding witchcraft were incorporated directly into colonial law. Clergy preached against Satan's influence. Magistrates prepared to confront it. By the time Salem Village was founded, the machinery of witch prosecution was already complete. What made witchcraft so powerful was not belief alone, it was institutional certainty. Courts accepted accusations. Churches endorsed interpretation. Laws prescribed punishment. There was no neutral ground. To question witchcraft was to question authority, To defend the accused was to invite suspicion. Silence was safer than doubt. Witchcraft in this system functioned as a legal explanation for uncertainty, and uncertainty was intolerable. By the late 17th century, the Atlantic Ocean had not diluted Europe's fear, it had concentrated it. In New England, theology was stricter, community bonds were tighter, survival felt fragile. When fear arrived in Salem in 1692, it did not need invention, it needed recognition. The laws were written, the beliefs were taught, the courts were ready. Salem did not create the witch hunt, it inherited it, and soon it would give it a name the world would never forget. Chapter 2. Salem in 1692. Community under pressure. Before the first whispers of witches drifted through Salem village, before fear found names and faces, the seeds had already been sown. The story of 1692 did not begin with spectres or spells. It began with the ordinary, family, land, and power, and with a community already burdened by discord. As we leave behind the European courts, the Malleus Maleficarum, and the shadow of institutionalized fear, we cross an ocean into a new world that carried its old terrors, refined, sharpened, and ready to ignite. Salem in 1692 was not a single town, but a collection of settlements, each with its own identity, its own tensions. At the center was Salem Town, a commercial hub of wealth, ambition, and opportunity. Ships came and went from its wharves, carrying goods, news, and influence. Its residents were merchants and tradesmen, men and women who measured life by property, profit, and social standing. A few miles inland lay Salem Village, more isolated, agrarian, and politically weaker. Its soil was rocky, its fields hard-won, and its inhabitants far more dependent on community consensus for survival. The village had a population of approximately 500 to 600 souls, and yet, despite its small size, it was a place heavy with tension. Land disputes ran like invisible lines through the village, slicing families against one another, generation after generation. Farms, inherited or purchased, were markers not just of wealth, but of status and security. When land was scarce, the inheritance of even a single acre could ignite resentment. Families that had tilled the same soil for decades found themselves at odds with neighbors, whose claims they deemed unfair, whose ambition they suspected of overreaching. These disputes, simmering quietly for years, created a community primed for suspicion, ready to turn fear into accusation. At the heart of this tension were two families whose rivalry would shape the social landscape of Salem Village, the Putnams and the Porters. The Putnams were village-aligned, conservative, and deeply invested in the agrarian way of life. They were known for their insistence on tradition, for their authority in local affairs, and for their desire to maintain control over the land that defined them. The Porters, by contrast, were allied with Salem Town. Wealthier, more outward-facing, and politically ambitious, they represented progress, trade, and a vision of society that threatened the old order. The rivalry between these families was not merely personal, it was emblematic of the fractures within the village itself, fissures along which fear and suspicion could travel. Into this already combustible environment arrived Reverend Samuel Parris in 1689, bringing with him not only sermons, but also strife. Parris, a man of strict Puritan convictions, preached with an intensity that unsettled many. His rigid enforcement of doctrine, combined with the ongoing disputes over his salary and his authority, made him a lightning rod for discontent. Parishioners quarreled over tithes, they muttered against his methods. His household, moreover, became a stage for tension, a microcosm of the village itself. His servants, children, and relatives observed and absorbed the same anxieties that rippled through the town, unaware that the smallest spark of unease could ignite a larger flame. Salem Village was not an isolated microcosm. Beyond its borders, the wider world pressed upon it, adding layers of fear. The late 17th century was an era of uncertainty for New England. Wars with neighboring Native American tribes had brought destruction and the memory of sudden, violent loss. The collapse of the original Massachusetts Charter in 1684 left a political vacuum that bred instability. Authority was questioned, governance uncertain, and many feared the consequences of lawlessness in both spiritual and civic terms. By the time the new Charter of 1691 arrived, establishing the province of Massachusetts Bay, it brought only partial stability. Villagers had endured years of political liminality, during which fear, rumor, and resentment had flourished unchecked. This was a village acutely aware of its own fragility. The wilderness surrounding Salem was not a neutral space. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and imagined as a domain of the devil. Each rustle of the trees, each shadow in the night, became imbued with meaning. In such a landscape, misfortune could not be dismissed. Crops that failed, livestock that perished, or illness that struck a neighbor were often interpreted as evidence of malign forces at work. The European inheritance of institutionalized fear, carried by Puritan theology and English law, found fertile soil in this landscape of suspicion. Yet fear alone is inert without a catalyst. In Salem, that spark emerged within Reverend Parris's own household. His daughter Betty and his niece Abigail Williams began exhibiting strange behaviors, fits, contortions, and unexplained ailments that drew attention and concern. Rumors of witchcraft quickly followed, but they did not exist in a vacuum. They were nourished by years of latent grievances, by land disputes, by family rivalries, and by political unrest. The Putnams, for example, seized the opportunity to channel their dissatisfaction into accusations that would weaken their adversaries. The Porters, the wealthier town-aligned faction, found themselves entangled in a struggle not only for power, but also for moral authority. The household disturbances, small as they seemed at first, were magnified by a community already tuned to see the invisible. People had been taught to interpret ordinary events as evidence of supernatural intent. A sudden death was not merely natural, it was the work of maleficium. A child's illness was not misfortune, it was proof of unseen malevolence. Every whispered suspicion, every unexplained occurrence, became a thread in a larger tapestry of fear. Salem's instability was not only social, but economic. The village's subsistence farming meant that every crop, every harvest, carried weighty consequences. Food scarcity, combined with unpredictable weather and harsh winters, magnified stress. Villagers relied on one another, yet mistrust made cooperation difficult. Each quarrel over land or inheritance did more than divide families. It eroded the very bonds necessary for survival. In such conditions, accusations of witchcraft offered a means to assert control, to justify resentment, and to reconcile the inexplicable with something tangible. By the time the first public accusations were made, the machinery of fear was already in motion. The religious teachings of the Puritans, inherited directly from European models, emphasized humanity's innate sinfulness, God's constant vigilance, and Satan's active interference. When Parris's household became the center of attention, it was not a matter of idle speculation, it was perceived as a spiritual emergency. To ignore the signs was to risk divine wrath. To question the accusers was to invite suspicion. And so, what began as a personal affliction within one household became a communal crisis, amplified by centuries of inherited fear and centuries of unresolved conflict. Salem's political instability, too, played a role. The long-standing uncertainty about authority and governance meant that villagers were accustomed to questioning leadership. This habit, combined with a rigid religious hierarchy, created a paradox: trust in some authorities, skepticism of others, and an ever-present anxiety that someone, somewhere, was operating outside God's will. Witchcraft accusations allowed villagers to define enemies, to locate blame, and to assert moral and social control in a world that seemed increasingly uncontrollable. The Putnam-Porter feud, which might have remained a quiet family rivalry, found expression through these accusations. Land, wealth, and social status were now entwined with spiritual legitimacy. By accusing neighbors of witchcraft, one could simultaneously avenge a perceived slight, protect one's property, and demonstrate piety. The act of accusation was not merely fear-driven, it was political, strategic, and socially sanctioned. Even within families, the strain was palpable. Children, influenced by the anxieties of their elders, mimicked fears and suspicions. Gossip, whispers, and observation became surveillance. Everyone became both witness and suspect. The boundaries between private grievance and public accusation blurred. Ordinary disputes over inheritance, over authority, over who held moral or social sway, were now reframed as cosmic battles between God and Satan, between good and evil. Thus, by 1692, Salem was a village under immense pressure. The European inheritance of legal and theological fear had met the New World realities of scarcity, isolation, and social division. Personal grievances, family rivalries, economic stress, and political uncertainty converged with spiritual anxiety to create a community on the brink. Witchcraft accusations were no longer extraordinary. They were inevitable. They were a natural outgrowth of a society conditioned to see malevolence, to seek justice, and to assert control through fear. The arrival of Reverend Paris, the household fits, the Putnam Porter rivalry, and the shadow of colonial instability, all these factors coalesced into a perfect storm. Salem Village was already a community primed for hysteria, and in this tension-laden environment, the unseen could be given shape, and the whispered could be declared truth. As night fell on Salem in 1692, the villagers did not yet know that history would remember them for terror. But they did know something crucial, that danger was real, that the devil walked among them, and that suspicion was a duty, not merely a sentiment. Fear, cultivated over decades, inherited from continents across the sea, and sharpened by local conditions, was now ready to ignite. And so, in the shadow of Reverend Paris's household, in the quiet fields and contested lands of Salem Village, the first threads of accusation were spun. The village's tensions, fears, and divisions would not simply vanish. They demanded resolution. Witchcraft provided it. Chapter 3. The 1692 Accusations. How Hysteria Became Evidence. The year was 1692, and Salem Village was already a landscape of tension, suspicion, and inherited fear. The machinery of witchcraft accusation, forged in European courts and transplanted to New England, was primed, but it required ignition. That ignition came not with thunder or lightning, but with the quiet, unsettling cries of two children in Reverend Samuel Paris's household. Their suffering, sudden, mysterious, and terrifying, would soon become the evidence that bound an entire community in fear. Betty Paris, the Reverend's 9-year-old daughter, was the first to fall, her body contorted in spasms that defied explanation. Her voice, once soft and obedient, became a source of terror. Abigail Williams, Paris's 11-year-old niece, followed, her limbs twisting, her shrieks echoing through the small house. It was not merely a display of illness, it was a spectacle of the supernatural. Their complaints were strange and specific, invisible forces pressing down upon them, spectral fingers clawing at their bodies, shapes that no eye could see yet, that brought them agony. In a community already trained to fear the devil, such displays could only mean one thing. The local physician, Dr. William Griggs, examined the children. He found no earthly explanation for their suffering. Their symptoms, convulsions, screaming, odd postures, and claims of being restrained by invisible hands defied medical knowledge. In the minds of the villagers, there was only one conclusion: bewitchment. The devil was at work, and the children were his unwilling witnesses. Here, for the first time, private fear became communal suspicion. The invisible had a body, the spiritual had a voice. The first accusations were swift, and they targeted the most vulnerable, the easiest to demonize. In February of 1692, 3 names emerged. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean in the Paris household; Sarah Good, a beggar at the margins of society; and Sarah Osborne, another social outcast with little protection against suspicion. These women embodied the fears of Salem village. They were outsiders, poor, dependent, and vulnerable, precisely the qualities that made accusation credible. The villagers did not need proof of their guilt. Their position in society, their differences from the community norm, sufficed. Tituba, already familiar with the stories of magic from her native culture, confessed under the weight of interrogation. Her confession was vivid, theatrical, and devastating in its consequences. She spoke of flying through the night, of animal familiars, spirits bound to witches, and of other witches, naming neighbors, acquaintances, and members of the village. Each name she spoke became a spark, a seed of panic. Confession, once obtained, created its own reality. What was spoken aloud was believed to be true, and truth required action. It was at this moment that hysteria became evidence. Before Tituba's words, fear was abstract. After them, it became verifiable. Spectral attacks, invisible fingers, and nightly flights were not simply rumors. They were witnessed in the bodies and voices of children, corroborated by the confession of a supposed witch. Authority, previously based on law, scripture, and social hierarchy, now rested on accusation and testimony. In Salem, belief was sufficient, proof was unnecessary. The accusations expanded rapidly, moving from the margins of society to the very center of the village. Women of low status were first, but soon no one was immune. Church members, long respected for their piety, found themselves named. Landowners, the pillars of the community, were accused alongside clergy. The network of suspicion spread like a web, each thread vibrating with fear, resentment, and ambition. Every accusation reinforced the last. Each confession lent credibility to the next. In a matter of weeks, Salem was caught in a storm of belief, where evidence was no longer gathered, it was conjured by fear itself. The role of confession cannot be overstated. Once an accused spoke, whether truthfully or under duress, the community received confirmation. A person's own words became proof, transforming them into instruments of their own condemnation. When Tituba named others, she legitimized fear. When she described meetings with the devil, she gave structure to suspicion. The villagers no longer asked if witches were real. The question became, who among us is guilty? Children, particularly, became both witnesses and arbiters of truth. Betty Paris and Abigail Williams were now authorities. Their testimony carried weight because it was framed as the innocent voice of suffering, untainted by ambition or malice. When they pointed fingers or screamed at the sight of invisible tormentors, adults believed. Adults, in turn, used these cries to accuse their neighbors. In Salem, innocence was power, and hysteria could decree justice. Fear in Salem was a currency that could be spent to settle scores, defend property, or assert moral superiority. Long-standing family disputes, like the rivalries between the Putnams and the Porters, found expression through accusations. Land inheritance, social standing, and political influence could be pursued under the guise of defending God's order. Witchcraft accusations offered an avenue to resolve tensions that had simmered for years, transforming private grievance into public action. The spread of accusations illustrates a chilling logic. As more names were spoken, more suspicion arose. The social contagion was immediate and unrelenting. Even the most respected members of Salem could not escape scrutiny. Each accusation demanded another, creating a feedback loop where fear became both the cause and the consequence of belief. Communities, trained to watch, interpret, and judge, now found themselves under the watchful eye of a system that conflated evidence with hysteria. By the summer of 1692, Salem was a crucible. The village's population, small and intimate, allowed suspicion to travel quickly. Families who had lived side by side for decades now measured neighbors by whispered reports. Every illness, accident, or misfortune could be reframed as evidence. Children's fits were no longer private disturbances, they were public declarations of divine truth. Adults, under pressure from both spiritual and social forces, were compelled to act. The line between reality and interpretation blurred, and the machinery of law, religion, and fear worked seamlessly to produce accusation as proof. Yet it was not only fear that drove the panic. Authority played a central role. Ministers and magistrates, trained in European legal traditions and Puritan theology, treated accusations as credible evidence. The courts relied on spectral testimony, the claims that spirits or visions were tormenting victims. The standard of proof was redefined. Physical evidence became secondary to belief. Community testimony outweighed material facts. In this environment, confession and accusation were not only sufficient, they were decisive. Even the smallest gesture could become damning. A scowl, a harsh word, or a moment of disagreement could be interpreted as alignment with the devil. Witchcraft was everywhere because suspicion had become the lens through which reality was interpreted. Spectres, curses, and malice were not fabrications, they were manifestations of the villagers' fear, shaped and confirmed by the very people who experienced them. In this sense, hysteria did not merely accompany accusation, it produced it. The children's fits, the confessions, the whispered suspicions, all became the building blocks of evidence itself. As accusations spread beyond the first three women, the network of panic enveloped Salem entirely. Friends accused friends, neighbors accused neighbors, and even families accused their own kin. The social fabric, already strained by disputes, land tensions, and political uncertainty, began to tear. Witchcraft became the vocabulary for addressing conflict, the tool for negotiating authority, and the explanation for every misfortune. The invisible hand of the devil now moved through every corner of the village, seen in every convulsion, heard in every scream, and believed in every whispered accusation. In retrospect, the 1692 accusations illustrate a terrifying dynamic. Belief became reality. Hysteria was self-validating. Confession created credibility. Accusation created authority. Once the community accepted that witches were among them, every event, every odd gesture, every accident, every fit became evidence. The legal system, previously inherited from Europe and the Puritan colonies, reinforced this cycle. Courts did not ask for proof beyond testimony. They asked only who was guilty. The lessons of Salem are woven from human behavior as much as law. Power, fear, resentment, and the need for order converged to create a system in which the invisible could dictate reality. Children, enslaved individuals, and the socially marginalized were the first victims because they were the most vulnerable. Yet even the most influential and respected members of the community could not escape once the cycle of accusation gained momentum. By the time the first executions were carried out later in 1692, belief had already supplanted proof. The village had learned a new logic. To be accused was to be guilty. To confess was to survive a little longer. And to resist was to invite further suspicion. The very mechanism of legal authority had been transformed into a conduit for panic. Salem had crossed the threshold where the ordinary rules of evidence no longer applied, and hysteria had become law. Through the unfolding of these events, we understand how Salem's fear was not spontaneous. It was a product of inherited terror from Europe, local tensions, economic pressures, and political uncertainty. Hysteria required conditions, and in Salem, every condition existed: a community under pressure, children whose suffering could not be ignored, an enslaved woman and social outcasts ready to be blamed, and a system prepared to legitimize accusation. The result was an explosion of fear in which the unseen, the whispered, and the imagined became the evidence of a witch's guilt. The first accusations, beginning with Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, set a precedent that would shape every trial that followed. Confession and accusation became the lifeblood of the witch hunt, and the social order of Salem, already delicate, now depended on sustained belief in the reality of witches. The machinery set in motion by fear, inherited law, and religious doctrine was now irreversible. By tracing the 1692 accusations, we see the anatomy of panic. The vulnerable were named first. The community responded collectively. Suspicion became justification, and belief became proof. Hysteria was no longer private. It had become evidence, legal and spiritual, shaping the course of history and leaving a mark that would never fade from the memory of Salem village or the world. Chapter 4. The Court's Executions, 1692. By the summer of 1692, Salem was no longer a village merely filled with whispers and fear. It had become a theatre of accusation, where suspicion was law and belief was proof. What had begun with the convulsions of children and the confessions of the vulnerable now required formal authority. The machinery of justice, inherited from European precedent and sharpened by Puritan doctrine, moved inexorably forward. In May of that year, the Court of Oyer and Terminer was established, and with it, fear found its instrument, precise and deliberate, to transform accusation into execution. The court arrived like an inevitable tide. Judges, imbued with both civic power and moral certainty, presided over a process that would leave an indelible mark on the village. William Stutton, the chief magistrate, carried the authority of both the crown and God. In his hands, the ancient machinery of law merged with the inherited terrors of witchcraft. The purpose of the court was not to seek doubt, not to test the innocence of the accused. It was, instead, to confirm the fears of a community, to validate what the village already believed. Accusation had become reality, and the law existed to make it so. From the very first day, the rules of justice were unlike any that we recognize today. There were no defense lawyers, no presumption of innocence, and no neutral inquiry. The accused could speak, yes, but their words were often treated with suspicion. Silence was dangerous, resistance fatal. The court accepted spectral evidence, visions, dreams, and ghostly appearances as sufficient for conviction. A person's soul, it was believed, could betray them even if the body did not. If a witness claimed to see a spectre inflicting harm, the accused could be condemned without question. Logic, reason, or tangible proof were irrelevant. It was in this strange, chilling logic that the first sentences were pronounced. 19 lives would be extinguished by the noose in the months that followed. 14 women, 5 men. Each hanging was carried out with a semblance of solemnity, but behind the ritual was fear as much as law. Execution became both punishment and warning, a statement to the living that the machinery of accusation was unstoppable. Communities that had once been neighbors now observed the consequences of deviation, of suspicion, and of failure to conform. Among the most extraordinary and haunting cases was that of Giles Corey, a man aged around 80, whose defiance of the court became legend. When pressed to plead, Corey refused. He did not confess. He did not claim innocence. Instead, he endured the peine forte et dure, a brutal practice in which heavy stones were laid upon the body until it yielded or life ended. Corey would not yield, and he would not name accomplices. His death, slow and deliberate, became a symbol of both the cruelty and the rigidity of the system. In that act, the court demonstrated that punishment was not merely for witches alone. It was for anyone who challenged authority, anyone who refused to bow to the machinery of belief. Over the course of the trials, more than 200 people were accused. The charges were not limited to those already marginalized by society. They extended into the community's elite. Landowners, respected church members, and figures of local influence all found themselves ensnared. The court's acceptance of spectral evidence meant that no one could feel entirely safe. Every glance, every slight, every whispered quarrel could be interpreted as alignment with the devil. Justice, once thought to provide order, now validated fear itself. The influence of the clergy added layers of complexity to the proceedings. Cotton Mather, a prominent minister, urged caution in the application of evidence. He warned against rash condemnation, yet he stopped short of opposing the trials entirely. His voice was one of moderation, but it was drowned out by the momentum of hysteria and the public's demand for resolution. Increase Mather, his father, would later condemn the use of spectral evidence, recognizing the danger of allowing visions and dreams to dictate life and death. At the time, however, the courts were empowered by a combination of theology and law, and the guidance of cautious ministers could not halt the machinery already in motion. Executions proceeded in sequence, each one reinforcing the credibility of the last. The community watched, learning that accusation, confession, and compliance were inextricably bound to survival. The accused, often trembling and defiant in turn, were paraded before the court, subjected to questioning that demanded names, associations, and acknowledgement of malevolent acts. Confession, once obtained, fueled new accusations. Denial often resulted in harsher punishment. The system was self-perpetuating, a dark logic in which belief created its own evidence. Hysteria intertwined with law in every case. When a child claimed to see a spectre, or when a neighbor accused another of causing illness or crop failure, the courts recognized this as valid testimony. The invisible became concrete, fear was given weight, and accusation became proof. In a village still reeling from economic pressures, family disputes, and inherited resentments, the courts offered a structured, almost ritualistic outlet for these tensions. Legal authority legitimized what had previously been communal suspicion, transforming personal grievances into official charges of witchcraft. It is important to remember that this was not chaos, in the sense of disorder. It was systematic. Judges, ministers, and jurors worked within a framework that combined inherited European legal practice with Puritan theology. The court itself, designed to resolve accusations, became a mechanism of panic, giving authority to suspicion and confirming the fears already embedded in the village. Spectral evidence, previously dismissed as superstition, was codified as legitimate. The law, once a protector, became a tool of enforcement, of social control, and of fear. Even those who had attempted caution were powerless. Cotton Mather's admonitions, measured and reasoned, were insufficient to slow the tide. Community belief, legal procedure, and inherited theology moved in concert. Execution was not arbitrary, it was inevitable. Once a single individual was condemned, the precedent allowed the machinery to continue, expanding the reach of accusation. Every death validated the next, creating a momentum that could not be reversed without challenging the fundamental assumptions of the village itself. The psychological impact of the court system was profound. Families were torn apart. Neighbors who had once collaborated or intermarried now watched one another with suspicion. Fear became embedded in daily life. Every cough, every fall, every moment of illness was reframed as evidence of malevolent influence. Children who had been witnesses became authorities. Spectral evidence, confessions, and accusations formed a lattice through which reality itself was interpreted. In this environment, survival depended on compliance, silence, or careful accusation. Defiance, whether moral, verbal, or spiritual, invited death. By September of 1692, the outcomes were stark. 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and over 200 accused. The village's social fabric was irrevocably altered. Economic, political, and familial tensions, once latent, had been brought into the open through the lens of witchcraft. The court had confirmed what Salem had already feared, that the devil walked among them, and that no one, regardless of age, gender, or status, could be considered safe. The legal system, far from checking panic, had amplified it. the legacy of the Court of Oyer and Terminer was both immediate and enduring. In the short term, it produced a series of executions that terrorized the village. In the long term, it demonstrated how belief, fear, and legal authority could intertwine to deadly effect. The lessons of Salem's courts resonate through history because they reveal the danger of a system in which authority is exercised without skepticism, and belief is treated as evidence. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these months is that the machinery required no extraordinary malevolence. There was no plot, no grand conspiracy, no mass intent to harm. Instead, the system functioned on inherited fear, social tension, and legal validation. Ordinary people, acting within ordinary structures, carried out extraordinary acts of violence, each execution rationalized as an act of justice. In this sense, the horror of Salem was both systemic and intimate. The law itself was the instrument of terror. By the end of the summer of 1692, Salem had entered a new reality. The invisible, once imagined in whispers, had been given form through legal authority. Children's fits, confessions of the vulnerable, and spectral evidence combined with the machinery of the courts to produce outcomes that were terrifyingly concrete. 19 lives were lost, countless others were scarred. The social hierarchy, political power, and familial networks of Salem were irreversibly reshaped. What began as accusation had become execution, and the legal system had sanctioned both. The story of Salem's courts is not merely a tale of cruelty, it is a window into the mechanics of fear, authority, and belief. When suspicion is codified, when accusation is treated as truth, and when the machinery of law accepts hysteria as evidence, ordinary communities can produce extraordinary horror. Salem was neither unique nor inexplicable. It was a place where inherited fear, religious doctrine, and legal authority converged. And yet, even amid the hangings and the pressing of Giles Corey, the system had cracks. Some voices called for caution, some doubted the evidence, but the momentum of belief, reinforced by law, was stronger than reason. The courts had become a crucible in which fear, accusation, and authority were fused. In this crucible, the social fabric of Salem was both tested and destroyed. By examining these months, the establishment of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, the acceptance of spectral evidence, the trials, the hangings, and the pressing, we see the culmination of a process that began decades, even centuries, earlier. European witchcraft laws, Puritan theology, local disputes, and inherited fear all converged in a system that produced death in the name of justice. The horror of Salem was not spontaneous. It was legal, systematic, and, in its own grim way, ordinary. The court confirmed what the villagers already feared. Witches were real, the devil walked among them, and law endorsed these truths. From June to September of 1692, the machinery of authority and the machinery of hysteria became indistinguishable. The village, once a community under pressure, had become a theatre of terror, and the shadow of the courts would linger long after the last execution. Chapter 5. The End, Apologies, Historical Significance. By the autumn of 1692, the air in Salem had grown thick not only with fear, but with the scent of inevitability. The village, once a theatre of accusation, had exhausted its spectacle of terror. 19 had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, over 200 accused, and countless lives shattered. The courts had performed their grim duty, confirming every suspicion, legitimizing every fear, and leaving the community scarred in ways no law could heal. Yet, even in this darkness, the machinery that had driven so many deaths began to falter. In October, a quiet but decisive authority intervened. Governor William Phips, acting from the distant seat of colonial power in Boston, suspended the trials. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved, leaving Salem to reckon with the consequences of its own machinery. By this point, the initial wave of accusations, once fueled by hysteria, childhood fits, and spectral evidence, had reached its limits. The law, which had so willingly accepted intangible spectres as proof, was confronted with the tangible result of its actions: the bodies of the executed, the terrified and broken, the families torn apart by suspicion and grief. The suspension was not merely a procedural act, it was a recognition, however muted, that fear alone could not constitute justice. By 1693, those remaining imprisoned on charges of witchcraft were released, their confinement ending not because they had been proven innocent, but because the authorities finally grasped that the foundation of the trials was unstable. This shift marked the first glimmer of institutional acknowledgement that what had been accepted as legitimate evidence, visions, confessions extracted under duress, accusations amplified by rumor, was not sufficient to sustain the machinery of execution. In the years that followed, the colony of Massachusetts attempted to address the moral and social rupture that the trials had inflicted. By 1697, a formal day of fasting and repentance was proclaimed. The community gathered in public acknowledgement to mourn the dead and to confront the collective guilt of the living. Ministers preached sermons in which they lamented the ease with which fear had overridden compassion, the speed with which neighbor turned against neighbor, and the tragic consequences of allowing suspicion to guide action. This ceremonial act of contrition was not merely symbolic. It was an early acknowledgement that society must find ways to restrain panic and fear, even when those forces appeared justified by belief. By 1711, Massachusetts took steps to offer material recompense. A compensation law was enacted, granting financial restitution to the families of those who had suffered under the accusations. It was, in part, an attempt to repair the harm done, to replace loss with measure, and to restore what could not truly be restored: the honor, the trust, the lives lost. Yet even these legal remedies carried the weight of their limitations. No sum could undo the trauma inflicted. No law could erase the fear embedded in the village's memory. The legal consequences of Salem were profound and enduring. The trials had revealed the catastrophic danger of accepting spectral evidence as proof. In the aftermath, courts across the colonies began to emphasize tangible, material evidence. Accusation without corroboration, belief without demonstration, could no longer serve as the basis for conviction. Salem became a cautionary tale, a demonstration of the necessity of due process, presumption of innocence, and procedural rigor. The village's dark experience served as a prism through which American law would gradually adopt greater safeguards against mass hysteria and institutionalized panic. Yet Salem's legacy extended beyond the courtroom. It seeped into the cultural consciousness, leaving shadows that would be drawn upon by writers, playwrights, and historians for centuries. In 1953, Arthur Miller would immortalize the trials in his play, The Crucible. Through the lens of drama, the events of 1692 were not merely recounted. They were interpreted, reframed, and applied to modern contexts, particularly the political witch hunts of Miller's own time. The term witch hunt itself entered the language as a metaphor, a shorthand for the perils of fear-driven accusation, whether in courtrooms, parliaments, or social discourse. Salem thus became both literal history and enduring symbol, a warning of what can happen when suspicion overwhelms reason. The process of legal exoneration would continue for centuries. In 1957, Massachusetts officially cleared the names of several individuals, acknowledging that the convictions were unjust. By 2001, final exonerations were issued for remaining cases, nearly 3 centuries after the first accusations. These acts of formal apology, though centuries late, reflect a persistent human desire to reckon with injustice, to use law not only as a tool of enforcement, but as a vehicle for moral acknowledgement. Salem had taught the world that institutions must act not only with authority, but with restraint, that legal power without caution can be as destructive as any imagined witch or spectre. Salem's significance, however, cannot be reduced solely to legal reform or literary allegory. It represents a profound intersection of belief, fear, authority, and community. The village of 1692 was not anomalous in its human tendencies. It was extraordinary in the alignment of social, religious, and legal pressures that turned ordinary suspicion into sanctioned terror. Fear, once embedded in legal and religious structures, became self-sustaining. Communities acted as instruments of authority, and authority validated community fear. This cycle, repeated across centuries and continents, is one reason the story of Salem resonates so profoundly. It is a warning about the fragility of reason in the face of collective dread. The psychological and social effects of the trials rippled far beyond the summer of 1692. Families bore the scars of accusation for generations. The dynamics of inheritance, land ownership, and local politics had been rearranged under the weight of suspicion. Children who had been witnesses grew up with memories of terror and complicity. Ministers who had guided the trials carried moral burdens that haunted sermons and decisions for decades. Salem had not merely punished witches, it had reshaped the moral and social fabric of an entire region. And yet, for all the remorse, all the apologies, and all the legal reforms, the shadow of 1692 remained. The trials exposed the danger inherent not only in superstition, but in human institutions themselves. When belief is sanctioned, when law amplifies fear rather than restrains it, the consequences are devastating. Salem reminds us that institutions, no matter how well-intentioned, can become conduits for horror if they fail to temper power with skepticism and compassion. As historians reflect, the lessons of Salem are both cautionary and enduring. The end of the trials was not the end of fear. Apologies could not restore lives. Compensation could not repair trust. Yet the village's reckoning with its own actions laid the groundwork for a more measured legal system, one that would eventually require evidence, testimony, and fairness over belief, vision, or rumor. Spectral evidence, once taken seriously, was forever discredited. Communities learned that fear, left unchecked, could be codified into law. Culturally, Salem's imprint continues to be felt. The metaphor of the witch hunt transcends the 17th century, appearing whenever mass accusation threatens reason. Literature, theatre, and film have perpetuated the story as both morality tale and historical record. In these narratives, the horror of Salem is not merely the violence of the hangings, but the human willingness to allow fear to dictate justice. The fascination endures because it is both specific and universal. A small village on the edge of the wilderness becomes a mirror for societies across time. Ultimately, the significance of Salem is not found solely in its tragic events, nor merely in the reforms that followed. It lies in the interplay of human psychology, community dynamics, religious belief, and legal authority. Salem exemplifies how ordinary people, acting within ordinary institutions, can produce extraordinary consequences. The village of 1692 was not merely a failure of imagination, nor a lapse in morality. It was a failure of institutions to restrain fear, to channel authority with caution, and to uphold justice in the face of panic. As we look back across the centuries, it becomes clear that Salem's story is not confined to history books. It is a living warning, whispered through the ages, when belief outweighs evidence, when fear outweighs reason, when authority is exercised without restraint, communities can unravel, and lives can be destroyed. The end of Salem was marked by apologies, fasting, and restitution, but the lesson endures. The shadow of those months in 1692 stretches far beyond the village, touching law, culture, and conscience for generations. In the quiet of the New England woods, the memory of Salem lingers. The trials have ended. The nooses are gone. The stones that pressed Giles Corey are long removed, yet the echo of fear, accusation, and institutional failure resonates still. History teaches, literature immortalizes, and law reforms, but the human tendency to let fear dictate action is never entirely extinguished. Salem reminds us that justice is not simply the absence of crime, nor the presence of authority. It is the careful, deliberate balance between belief and evidence, fear and reason, accusation and proof. Without that balance, even the most devout, the most orderly, and the most well-intentioned communities are capable of extraordinary horror. The village of Salem in 1692, now a distant memory, continues to speak across the centuries, a cautionary tale of the fragility of reason, the dangers of unrestrained authority, and the enduring consequences when institutions fail to restrain fear.